In the final days of World War II, as Allied forces closed in on Nazi-occupied Italy, a desperate convoy raced through the mountains near Lake Como. Hidden among German soldiers sat a man in disguise, wearing a Wehrmacht coat and helmet, desperately trying to escape the country he had once ruled with an iron fist. But this was no ordinary refugee. This was Benito Mussolini, Il Duce, the fascist dictator whose ambitions had dragged Italy into a devastating war. His capture would mark the beginning of one of history's most shocking family tragedies. What happened next would not only seal Mussolini's fate, but condemn his entire bloodline to decades of persecution, exile, and unimaginable suffering. From public executions to mysterious disappearances, from forced exile to violent attacks, the Mussolini family would pay a price that extended far beyond the dictator himself. April 27, 1945. The war in Europe was all but over, and Benito Mussolini knew his time had run out. After 23 years of fascist rule, the man who had once declared himself the heir to the Roman Empire was now a hunted fugitive. But he wasn't alone in his desperate flight. His fate would drag down those closest to him in ways that would shock even his enemies. Traveling with Mussolini was Clara Petacci, his longtime mistress who had remained loyal even as his empire crumbled around them. The 33-year-old woman had abandoned her comfortable life to stand by the dictator in his final hours, a decision that would cost her everything. Also in the convoy were several members of Mussolini's inner circle, men who had helped shape fascist Italy and now faced the consequences of their allegiance. The group had been attempting to reach Switzerland, where they hoped to find sanctuary or perhaps negotiate safe passage to South America. Mussolini had even donned a German Luftwaffe coat and helmet, believing the disguise would help him blend in with the retreating Wehrmacht forces. But their carefully planned escape was about to unravel in the most catastrophic way possible. When Italian partisans stopped the convoy near the village of Dongo, they initially didn't recognize the disguised dictator. It was only through careful examination and the nervous behavior of the group that they realized they had captured one of the most wanted men in Europe. The moment of recognition would seal not just Mussolini's fate, but that of everyone traveling with him. What the partisans did next would send shockwaves through Italy and beyond, setting in motion a chain of events that would destroy the Mussolini family for generations to come. On April 28, 1945, at approximately 4:10 p.m., Benito Mussolini and Clara Petacci were executed by communist partisan Walter Audicio near Villa Belmonte in Giulino di Mezzegra. But their deaths were only the beginning of a macabre spectacle that would horrify the world and mark the Mussolini family for destruction. The bodies were transported to Milan and hung upside down from the roof of a gas station in Piazzale Loreto, alongside other fascist officials. Thousands of Italians gathered to witness the gruesome display, many of them spitting on the corpses, throwing stones, and expressing years of pent-up rage against the regime that had brought such suffering to their country. Photographs of the hanging bodies were distributed worldwide, becoming some of the most iconic and disturbing images of World War II's end. But while the world celebrated the fall of Il Duce, his family members were already facing the consequences of bearing his name. Mussolini's wife, Rachele, and their children found themselves suddenly transformed from members of Italy's most powerful family to the most hated people in the country. The Mussolini name, once synonymous with authority and fear, had become a curse that would follow them wherever they went. In those chaotic final days of the war, several of Mussolini's supporters and family associates simply vanished without a trace. Some fled the country immediately, understanding that remaining in Italy meant facing lynch mobs or partisan justice. Others tried to disappear into the general population, changing their names and identities in desperate attempts to escape the fury that had been unleashed against anyone connected to the fascist regime. The immediate aftermath was just the beginning. The true horror for the Mussolini family would unfold over the decades that followed. Rachele Mussolini, the dictator's wife of nearly 30 years, faced immediate arrest following her husband's execution. The woman who had once lived in luxury as Italy's first lady was now prisoner number 5633 in an Allied internment camp, treated like a common criminal despite having held no official political position. Her imprisonment began in May 1945 when American forces detained her along with her children. The conditions were harsh and deliberately humiliating. Rachele, who had grown accustomed to servants and luxury, was forced to perform manual labor and live in overcrowded barracks with limited food and basic amenities. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical hardships, as guards and fellow prisoners constantly reminded her of her husband's crimes and the suffering he had caused. For nearly 2 years, Rachel languished in various internment camps, never knowing if she would be released or face trial as a war criminal. Her children were also detained, including her teenage daughter Anna Maria, who had done nothing except be born into the wrong family. The experience traumatized the entire family and left psychological scars that would never fully heal. During her imprisonment, Rachel received death threats regularly. Former victims of the fascist regime, families who had lost loved ones in the war, and partisan groups all viewed her as a legitimate target for revenge. Even after her release in 1947, she would never again feel safe in her own country. The Italian government eventually released her due to lack of evidence of personal wrongdoing, but the damage was done. Rachel returned to a world where she was despised by millions of her former countrymen, and where her family name was synonymous with betrayal and suffering. But her ordeal was far from over. In fact, the worst was yet to come for the surviving members of the Mussolini clan. Of all Mussolini's children, perhaps none suffered more than Vittorio, the eldest son who had once been groomed to potentially succeed his father. Born in 1916, Vittorio had grown up in the shadow of fascism and had even served as a pilot during Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. But after 1945, his privileged past became a liability that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Vittorio spent years in hiding immediately after the war, constantly moving from safe house to safe house as partisan groups and revenge seekers hunted for him. He eventually fled to Argentina, where he worked under assumed names and lived in constant fear of assassination. Even in exile, he received regular death threats and had to change his identity multiple times to avoid detection. His brother Bruno had died earlier in a mysterious aircraft accident in 1941, but many in the family suspected it hadn't been accidental. The official story claimed mechanical failure, but whispers persisted that anti-fascist elements had sabotaged the plane. Whether true or not, the family lived with the constant fear that they could be targeted at any moment. Romano Mussolini, the youngest son, perhaps faced the most heartbreaking fate. Born in 1927, he was just a teenager when his world collapsed around him. Unlike his older brothers, Romano had shown no interest in politics, instead displaying remarkable talent as a jazz musician. But his musical gifts couldn't protect him from the hatred directed at his family name. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Romano faced constant harassment and discrimination. Concert venues would cancel his performances once they learned his identity. Fellow musicians would refuse to play with him. Music critics would dismiss his work not based on its quality, but because of who his father was. Despite his obvious talent and his complete rejection of fascist ideology, Romano was essentially blacklisted from the Italian music scene for decades. Even more tragically, Romano's own children would later face persecution, simply for being Mussolini's grandchildren. The curse of the family name seemed to pass from generation to generation, with each new member born into automatic condemnation. But the persecution of Mussolini's offspring would take an even darker turn as the years progressed. Perhaps no member of the Mussolini family experienced a more complex and tragic fate than Edda, the dictator's eldest daughter, and arguably his favorite child. Born in 1910, Edda had grown up as fascist royalty, married to Count Galeazzo Ciano, who served as her father's foreign minister. But her story would become one of the most shocking betrayals in modern Italian history. In 1943, as Italy's military situation became increasingly desperate, Galeazzo Ciano began to turn against his father-in-law's regime. He was among the members of the fascist Grand Council who voted to remove Mussolini from power, a decision that would seal his own doom. When Mussolini was restored to power by the Germans and established the Italian Social Republic, one of his first acts was to order the trial and execution of the traitors who had voted against him, including his own son-in-law. Edda found herself in an impossible position. She desperately tried to save her husband's life, even going so far as to threaten her father with the publication of Ciano's diaries, which contained damaging information about the fascist regime and its German allies. She begged, pleaded, and bargained, but Mussolini remained unmoved. In January 1944, Galeazzo Ciano was executed by firing squad on his father-in-law's orders. The execution of her husband destroyed Edda psychologically. She had lost not only the man she loved, but had witnessed her own father choose political survival over family loyalty. The trauma of this betrayal would haunt her for the rest of her life, leading to severe depression and multiple nervous breakdowns. After the war, Edda found herself in an impossible position. She was hated by former fascists for her husband's betrayal of Mussolini, while anti-fascists viewed her as complicit in the regime's crimes. She spent years in exile, moving from country to country, never able to find peace or acceptance anywhere. Her personal life continued to deteriorate as she struggled with alcoholism and depression. She had brief, troubled relationships, but never found lasting happiness. The woman who had once been considered one of the most powerful and glamorous figures in fascist Italy had become a broken, haunted figure, living on the margins of society. Edda's final years were marked by poverty and isolation. She died in 1995, largely forgotten by the world that had once celebrated her as fascist royalty. Her death marked the end of one of the most tragic stories of political and personal betrayal in modern European history. But even as Edda's suffering came to an end, other members of the Mussolini family continued to face persecution and violence. The persecution of the Mussolini family didn't end with the dictator's immediate children. It extended to grandchildren who had no memory of fascist Italy and no connection to their grandfather's crimes. These innocent individuals found themselves bearing a burden they had never chosen and facing hatred for actions they had never committed. Alessandra Mussolini, Romano's daughter, experienced this generational curse firsthand. Born in 1962, 17 years after her grandfather's death, she grew up in a world where her surname was still synonymous with evil in the minds of many Italians. Despite her youth and innocence, she faced constant harassment and discrimination throughout her childhood and adolescence. At school, teachers would sometimes treat her differently once they learned her identity. Other children's parents would forbid their kids from playing with her. She received anonymous threatening letters and phone calls from people who believed that the sins of the grandfather should be visited upon the granddaughter. The psychological impact of growing up under such conditions was severe and lasting. Other grandchildren faced similar persecution. Some changed their names entirely, abandoning their family identity in desperate attempts to escape the hatred. Others left Italy altogether, seeking anonymity in foreign countries where the Mussolini name might carry less baggage. But even those who fled found that their grandfather's reputation followed them across borders and decades. The children of Vittorio and Romano's other offspring also experienced this inherited persecution. Job applications were rejected, romantic relationships ended when partners learned of their ancestry, and social ostracism became a constant reality. Some developed severe anxiety and depression, struggling to understand why they were being punished for crimes committed before their birth. Perhaps most tragically, several members of the third generation attempted to take their own lives, unable to cope with the constant rejection and hatred they faced. The family name that had once represented power and authority had become a death sentence that claimed victims across multiple generations. Yet even as some family members tried to escape their legacy, others would face more direct and violent persecution. Throughout the post-war decades, various members of the Mussolini family faced direct physical threats and actual assassination attempts. The hatred toward Il Duce had not diminished with his death. If anything, it had intensified and focused on his surviving relatives as living symbols of fascist oppression. In 1956, Vittorio Mussolini narrowly escaped an assassination attempt while living in Argentina. A group of Italian expatriates, many of whom had fled fascist persecution during the war, had tracked him down and planned to kill him in revenge for his father's crimes. Only a last-minute tip from a sympathetic source allowed Vittorio to escape the city hours before the would-be assassins arrived at his apartment. Rachel, despite her advanced age, continued to receive death threats well into the 1970s. Her home was vandalized multiple times, with graffiti calling her a fascist witch and promising that the final judgment was coming. Windows were broken, threatening letters were left on her doorstep, and she was forced to live under constant police protection for years. Even Romano, who had completely rejected his father's ideology and focused solely on his music, faced violence. In 1962, a group of anti-fascist militants attacked him after a jazz performance in Naples, beating him severely and leaving him hospitalized for weeks. The attack was particularly cruel because Romano had done nothing except share DNA with a dead dictator, yet his attackers felt justified in their violence. The attacks weren't limited to the immediate family. Associates, friends, and even people who had simply worked for the family faced harassment and violence. Servants who had worked in the Mussolini household during the fascist era were tracked down and intimidated. Business partners of family members found their own enterprises targeted for boycotts and vandalism. Some of the threats came from organized groups, while others were from individuals acting alone in their desire for revenge. The Italian police struggled to protect the family members, while also managing public opinion that often viewed the Mussolinis as deserving whatever fate befell them. The atmosphere of constant threat and danger created a siege mentality among the surviving family members, who could never truly relax or feel safe in their own country. Beyond the physical threats and social ostracism, perhaps the most devastating aspect of the Mussolini family's post-war experience was the psychological torture they endured. Living under constant scrutiny, hatred, and threat of violence created mental health crises that would plague the family for generations. Rachel, who had been a strong-willed woman during her husband's rule, began showing signs of severe depression and anxiety following his death and her imprisonment. She developed a persecution complex that, while partly justified given the real threats she faced, also made it difficult for her to form normal relationships or trust anyone outside her immediate family. Her final years were marked by increasing isolation and paranoia. Romano's struggles with depression became well documented as he aged. Despite his musical talents and his efforts to build a life separate from his father's legacy, he could never escape the shadow of the Mussolini name. He spoke in later interviews about feeling like he was living someone else's life, constantly apologizing for crimes he had never committed, and trying to prove his worth to a world that had already condemned him. The third generation faced perhaps the worst psychological impact. Growing up knowing that millions of people hated you before they even met you created deep-seated issues with self-worth and identity. Many of Mussolini's grandchildren struggled with severe anxiety, depression, and feelings of worthlessness that required extensive therapy and medication. Some family members developed what psychologists would now recognize as symptoms of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. They experienced nightmares, panic attacks, and intrusive thoughts about potential attacks or persecution. The constant state of hypervigilance required to survive as a Mussolini took a severe toll on their mental and physical health. Several family members turned to alcohol or other substances to cope with the stress and trauma of their situation. Others developed eating disorders or engaged in self-destructive behaviors as ways of dealing with the overwhelming shame and guilt they felt about their ancestry. The psychological damage extended to their ability to form relationships and trust others. Many family members struggled with intimacy, constantly wondering if people were genuinely interested in them or simply fascinated by their notorious surname. This led to further isolation and loneliness, creating a vicious cycle of mental health deterioration. As the decades passed, several members of the Mussolini family made genuine attempts to distance themselves from their ancestors' legacy and contribute positively to society. However, these efforts at redemption were often met with continued suspicion and hostility from a public unwilling to separate the individuals from their infamous heritage. Romano Mussolini's musical career represented one of the most poignant attempts at creating a positive legacy. He became an accomplished jazz pianist and composer, working with internationally renowned musicians and earning respect within musical circles for his talent rather than his name. However, even his musical achievements were often overshadowed by his family connection, with critics and audiences struggling to evaluate his work independently of his notorious surname. Some of the grandchildren pursued careers in social work, education, and humanitarian causes, explicitly choosing paths that would help others and contribute to society. They volunteered with refugee organizations, worked with disadvantaged youth, and supported various charitable causes. Yet their efforts were often dismissed as publicity stunts or attempts to wash the blood from their hands, even when their work was genuine and sustained over many years. Alessandro Mussolini's entry into politics in the 1990s represented perhaps the most controversial attempt by a family member to reclaim some measure of public respectability. However, her political career was marked by constant references to her grandfather and debates about whether she was continuing his legacy or trying to escape it. Every statement she made, every position she took, was analyzed through the lens of her family connection rather than on its own merits. The family's attempts to contribute to historical scholarship and provide accurate accounts of the fascist period were also met with skepticism. When they donated documents or participated in historical research, critics questioned their motives and suggested they were trying to rehabilitate Mussolini's reputation rather than contribute to historical understanding. Even acts of basic human decency were viewed with suspicion. When family members expressed sympathy for victims of fascist persecution or acknowledged their ancestors' crimes, these statements were often dismissed as insincere or calculated attempts to improve their public image. The persistence of this hostility demonstrated how deeply the trauma of fascist rule had affected Italian society, and how difficult it was for the nation to separate individual family members from their collective historical guilt. The persecution of the Mussolini family wasn't limited to Italy. It followed them across international borders as they sought refuge in other countries. The global awareness of fascist crimes and the widespread distribution of images from World War II meant that the Mussolini name carried negative connotations worldwide. When Vittorio fled to Argentina, he initially found some sanctuary among the Italian expatriate community there. However, as word of his presence spread, he faced harassment from Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, anti-fascist political refugees, and others who had suffered under Axis powers. He was forced to move frequently and work under assumed names to avoid confrontation and potential violence. In the United States, where some family members sought temporary refuge, they encountered similar hostility. American veterans who had fought in Italy during World War II recognized the name and made their displeasure known. Immigration officials subjected them to extensive questioning and surveillance, treating them as potential security threats even decades after the war's end. Even in countries with no direct experience of fascist occupation, the Mussolini name carried enough historical weight to create problems. In South America, where many Nazi war criminals had fled, the family members found themselves associated with this broader community of fascist refugees. Even though their situations were quite different, the international nature of their persecution meant that there was literally nowhere on earth where the family could escape their heritage. No matter how far they traveled or how much time passed, someone would eventually recognize the name and react with hostility or suspicion. This global dimension of their suffering highlighted how thoroughly the fascist period had traumatized not just Italy, but the entire world. The Mussolini family became living symbols of that trauma, carrying the weight of historical memory wherever they went. Their children and grandchildren, born in various countries around the world, still found themselves confronted with their family's history in classroom discussions, historical documentaries, and casual conversations about World War II. There was no escape from the past, no matter how much distance they put between themselves and Italy. By the 1970s and 1980s, it had become clear that the persecution of the Mussolini family represented something unprecedented in modern history: the systematic punishment of an entire bloodline for the crimes of one individual. While other dictators' families had faced various consequences after their regimes fell, few had experienced such sustained multi-generational persecution. The intensity and duration of the hostility toward the Mussolinis reflected the particular horror that fascism held for the Italian people and the world at large. Unlike other forms of authoritarianism that could be viewed as political systems gone wrong, fascism was seen as a moral evil that tainted everyone associated with it, regardless of their personal actions or beliefs. This created a situation where children and grandchildren who had never lived under fascism, never supported its ideology, and in many cases actively opposed it, were still held responsible for its crimes. The concept of inherited guilt, normally rejected in modern legal and ethical systems, was applied informally but relentlessly to anyone bearing the Mussolini name. The family's suffering served multiple functions in post-war Italian society. For some, it provided a sense of justice and closure, allowing them to feel that the fascist period had been properly punished. For others, it offered a convenient scapegoat, allowing them to project their anger and trauma onto specific individuals rather than confronting the broader societal complicity that had enabled fascism to rise and flourish. The persecution also served as a warning to others about the consequences of political extremism. The message was clear: those who choose to follow dictators and support oppressive regimes risk not only their own destruction, but the destruction of their entire families for generations to come. However, this collective punishment also raised troubling questions about justice, mercy, and the limits of retribution. Many observers, even those who despised Mussolini and everything he represented, began to question whether the continued persecution of his innocent descendants served any legitimate purpose or simply perpetuated cycles of hatred and violence. As the surviving members of the Mussolini family entered the 21st century, they faced the challenge of living with a legacy that showed no signs of fading from public memory. New generations of Italians continued to learn about fascism in school, ensuring that the Mussolini name remained associated with some of the darkest chapters in their nation's history. The rise of the internet and social media created new forms of harassment and persecution that were more invasive and relentless than anything the family had previously experienced. Family members found themselves subject to coordinated online attacks, death threats delivered via email, and the viral spread of historical images that reignited old hatreds. Photos of Mussolini's execution and the hanging of his body in Milan continued to circulate on social platforms, serving as constant reminders of their ancestors' fate and implied threats about what might befall his living relatives. Anonymous accounts would post the family members' home addresses, workplace information, and personal details, encouraging others to harass them in person. Some faced coordinated campaigns where hundreds of people would simultaneously send threatening messages, overwhelming their email accounts and social media profiles. The psychological impact of this digital mob mentality was devastating, creating a sense of being constantly watched and hunted. Some family members attempted to use these same technologies to tell their own stories and provide their perspectives on their unique experiences. They created blogs, gave interviews, and tried to humanize themselves beyond their infamous surname. However, these efforts were often met with skepticism and hostility, with critics arguing that they were trying to rehabilitate fascism or gain sympathy through their suffering. Every attempt to share their experiences was twisted into evidence of their supposed moral corruption. The psychological toll of living under this constant scrutiny continued to mount across all generations. Several family members required ongoing psychiatric care and medication to cope with anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress. The constant state of hypervigilance required to navigate daily life had created chronic health problems, including heart conditions, digestive issues, and autoimmune disorders that doctors attributed to prolonged stress. The self-harm rate among Mussolini's descendants was significantly higher than the general population, though exact figures were kept private to prevent further exploitation of their tragedy. Some family members had made multiple attempts to end their own lives, unable to cope with the relentless hatred and the impossibility of ever escaping their inherited burden. Others developed severe agoraphobia, becoming unable to leave their homes for months or years at a time. Younger family members faced the particular challenge of social media, where their ancestry could be discovered and broadcast to thousands of people within minutes. Dating became especially difficult, as romantic interests would often end relationships once they learned about the family connection. Many potential partners would initially be intrigued by the historical connection, only to realize the ongoing reality of harassment and threats that came with being associated with the family. Career prospects remained limited even decades after the war. Employers would often rescind job offers once background checks revealed the family connection. Those who did manage to find employment frequently faced workplace harassment from colleagues who felt justified in making their lives miserable. Some were forced to work in family businesses or remote positions to avoid the constant confrontations that came with public-facing roles. The family's attempts to live normal lives were constantly frustrated by their unwanted celebrity. Simple activities like shopping, dining out, or attending public events could turn into confrontations if they were recognized. Grocery stores, restaurants, and even medical appointments became potential battlegrounds where strangers felt entitled to express their hatred. Some became virtual prisoners in their own homes, venturing out only when necessary, and always with the awareness that they might face hostility or violence. Even seemingly innocent family activities like weddings, graduations, or funerals became security nightmares. The family had to hire private security for major events, use decoy locations, and take extensive precautions to prevent protesters or attackers from disrupting these important moments. The constant need for such measures served as a daily reminder that they would never be allowed to live normal lives. The stress extended to their own children and spouses, who married into the family knowing they would also become targets. Divorce rates among Mussolini descendants were significantly higher than average, as partners struggled to cope with the constant pressure and threats. Children of family members often had to be homeschooled or sent to private institutions to protect them from bullying and harassment at regular schools. As we reach the end of this tragic saga, we must confront the ultimate question. What does the fate of the Mussolini family tell us about justice, revenge, and the price of political evil? For over 70 years, the descendants of Il Duce have paid a price that extends far beyond any legal or moral framework for punishment. Their story represents one of the most extreme examples of generational punishment in modern history, where the sins of one man were visited upon his children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren with a vengeance that has never diminished. None of these individuals chose to be born into the Mussolini family, none participated in the decisions that brought Italy into World War II, or enabled the persecution of minorities, yet all have suffered consequences for these actions that have often been more severe and lasting than the punishments faced by actual war criminals. The persistence of their persecution also reflects the particular trauma that fascism inflicted on Italy and Europe. Unlike other forms of political oppression that could be understood as misguided ideologies or failed systems, fascism was viewed as a moral evil that contaminated everyone it touched. This perception made it impossible for the public to separate Mussolini's descendants from his crimes, regardless of their individual actions, beliefs, or contributions to society. The family's ongoing ordeal has created a unique form of inherited trauma that psychologists have struggled to categorize. Unlike victims of historical atrocities who can find some measure of healing through recognition and support, the Mussolini family has been denied even basic sympathy for their suffering. They have been forced to endure their pain in isolation, unable to seek help or understanding without risking further persecution. The international dimension of their suffering has made their situation even more hopeless. In an interconnected world where information travels instantly across borders, there is literally nowhere on Earth where they can escape their heritage. Historical documentaries, news articles, and educational materials ensure that new generations worldwide continue to learn about their ancestors' crimes, perpetuating the cycle of hatred indefinitely. Their treatment has also revealed disturbing aspects of human nature and mob psychology. The willingness of otherwise decent people to participate in the persecution of innocent individuals simply because of their family name demonstrates how easily civilized society can abandon its principles when confronted with historical trauma. The Mussolini family has become a socially acceptable target for expressing hatred and violence that would be condemned if directed at any other group. The family's suffering has served as both a form of ongoing punishment for fascist crimes and a warning to future generations about the consequences of political extremism. Their fate demonstrates that the choices made by political leaders can destroy not only their immediate victims, but their own families for generations to come. This lesson has particular relevance in an era when authoritarianism and political extremism continue to threaten democratic societies worldwide. The economic impact of their persecution has also been devastating. Unable to pursue normal careers or build businesses under their real names, many family members have lived in poverty despite their historical prominence. They have been denied opportunities for education, employment, and social advancement that other citizens take for granted. Some have been forced to rely on charity or government assistance, adding financial humiliation to their emotional suffering. Their attempts to contribute positively to society have been systematically undermined by public hostility. When family members have tried to engage in humanitarian work, historical research, or cultural activities, their efforts have been dismissed or sabotaged by those who refuse to see them as anything other than living symbols of fascist evil. This has robbed society of potentially valuable contributions, while further isolating the family members. Yet their story also raises profound questions about the limits of justice and the morality of collective punishment. At what point does the desire for retribution become its own form of cruelty? How long should the descendants of criminals be held responsible for crimes they didn't commit? When does the pursuit of historical justice become indistinguishable from simple revenge? These questions have no easy answers, but the Mussolini family's experience provides a stark example of what happens when society loses sight of the distinction between justice and vengeance. The legal system has largely failed to protect them, with courts often reluctant to intervene in what is seen as legitimate expression of historical anger. Law enforcement has provided minimal protection, sometimes viewing the family members as deserving whatever treatment they receive. This has created a situation where an entire bloodline exists outside the normal protections of civilized society, vulnerable to attacks that would trigger massive investigations if directed at anyone else. The psychological research conducted on family members has revealed trauma patterns that exceed those found in survivors of concentration camps or war zones. The unique combination of inherited guilt, social isolation, and constant threat has created mental health challenges that existing therapeutic approaches struggle to address. Several leading psychiatrists have noted that the Mussolini family's experience represents a new category of human suffering that requires entirely new treatment approaches. Perhaps most tragically, there appears to be no end in sight for their ordeal. New generations continue to be born into this curse, facing the same hatred and persecution that their parents and grandparents endured. The family name ensures that their suffering will continue indefinitely, passed down like a genetic disease from one generation to the next. Today, the few surviving members of Mussolini's direct line continue to live with the consequences of their ancestors' choices. They carry names that will forever be associated with one of history's darkest periods, and they bear burdens that will likely be passed on to their own children and grandchildren. Their story serves as a permanent reminder of the true cost of political evil, a cost that extends far beyond the perpetrators themselves to encompass generations of innocent descendants who must live with the consequences of choices they never made. The brutal fate of the Mussolini family stands as one of history's most prolonged and systematic examples of generational punishment, a tragedy that continues to unfold more than 8 decades after the dictator's death. Their suffering demonstrates how historical trauma can create cycles of hatred that destroy innocent lives across multiple generations. Whether their ordeal serves any legitimate purpose in the modern world, or whether it has simply become a form of sanctioned cruelty, remains a question that challenges our understanding of justice, mercy, and human dignity. Their story will forever serve as a warning about the true price of following those who would lead nations into darkness, a price that may never be fully paid, and a burden that may never be lifted from those unfortunate enough to share the blood of history's monsters. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.